Hi, this will be a quick overview of Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is pretty comprehensive, so I'm going to whittle it down to just the essentials. In this one, we're moving from Chapter 1, where we were basically, it was an overview of the process of the assessment, and now we're going to move into the context. So, the chapter starts off first by um, talking about, on page 23, the profile of the children served under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004. It's important to know the profile. Again, this is an older textbook. Um, it was, I believe, most of the data that is reported in here is from like the 1999 to 2001 school year. And so obviously I'm going to report these kinds of numbers with caution, just for you to remember that obviously it's over 10 years old, and so um, it's a good jumping off point though. Um, Profile of the students served. On page 23 of your textbook, it talks about back in 2001 there were 48,489,537 individuals 6 to 21 years in the total in the U.S. For served under IDEA. So I don't have current numbers on that, but you can kind of go from there. Income level, gender, those types of things. From the other classes, you should have an awareness of things like that already. You know, typically students from low socioeconomic status are identified more readily than those that are not. As far as gender goes, males are more frequently identified than females. So you can read through that information within the textbook, but I'm not going to hit on it just because it's such old data, and we have updated information on that I'll try to bring to class. I know that in a lot of your other classes, especially your summer classes, we've talked about quite a bit of this, and that's why I'm going to go over it pretty quickly. Moving back, you have to be very familiar with the disability categories. In Texas, there are 13. In this book, it talks about the 13 different disability categories, but these are under IDEA. And so as far as state goes, I've added the ones that you're going to see specific to Texas. So it's important that you differentiate the two, because there is a difference if you're practicing in Texas and you are practicing in another state. They vary state to state. So of the 13 different disability categories, autism, deafblindness, auditory impairment, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, aka mental retardation, that has been formally changed from MR to ID, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, learning disability, speech impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, and developmental delay. So it's very important for you to have an awareness of these 13 different disability categories, because you as a diagnostician will be a part of diagnosing every single one of these. You may not be the sole person doing the evaluation for each one of these disabilities, but you will be a part of that team. For this class specifically, we'll be referencing all of these 13 different ones, but because we're focusing on IQ assessment, the two disability categories that we're really going to be focusing on are, I'm going to let you fill in the blank. There's going to be two. In this class, we're going to be focusing on intellectual disability, and we're going to be focusing on the learning disability. Both of those disability categories one of the requirements for diagnosis of intellectual disability ID or learning disability LD is an IQ assessment. So while IQ assessments can be used for a variety of different reasons, specifically those two disability categories will be talked about most in the class. Coming over to page, again we're going to skim over a lot of this because a lot of it's just not, doesn't apply to what we're doing, but on page 26 it talks about school placements, and again this data is a little bit old, 2000, 2001. He reports that almost half of the students with disabilities were being educated in the regular classroom, about 80% of the time. I would expect those numbers to be much higher now with the big push for inclusion and very, very few exemptions for the high stakes testing. So I think there'd probably be a dramatic change in the LRE numbers. Also talks about IDEA expenditures. While we don't get into this a great deal, it is still important for you to know the financial obligations of IDEA. In 1999-2001, $50 billion was spent on serving students in special education, which is, to me, a huge number. And I'm sure that with the increase of our identification, we're looking at well over $50 billion today. This also goes to pay for, not only services, inside and outside public schools, homebound instructions, transportation services, support services. It also goes to due process mediation and litigation services as well. So we do pay for due process in certain situations. We talked about this summer the benefits of labeling students, the benefits and the risks of labeling students. So on page 27, it talks about those benefits of labeling students as well. Moving over to, we're going to move next and talk about the variables in assessment. A lot of this is in between is very specific to clinicians, those in a clinical practice, which we are not. So we're going to skip over a lot of those. If you have the time, you can go back and you can read just to have an awareness of that type of information. But as far as trying to speed things up a little bit, in the class, we're going to skip over that. I'm on page 38 now, where it starts to talk about variables to consider in an assessment. That chart on page 39, figure 2.1, those are factors influencing assessment data. So it's important for you to know things like innate factors, background variables, assessment situation, test demands, assessment data. So you need to read through those and make sure that you understand how these variables can affect outcomes in your assessments. And we'll be talking about these more with our face-to-face class. But you need to read through variables to consider in an assessment, starting on page 38, and that goes through 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, and 45, ending with the assessment data. So it's all pretty straightforward. Again, it's important before we get into assessments for you to understand the variables in assessment. You also need to know what can lead to poor test performance. This is on page 45 of your textbook, and how important it is to recognize when students do poorly on your assessment. And not only recognize that they do poorly, because we all do that. We all report, yes, the student performed poorly on this, and that. But why did they perform poorly? It's really quick for us to say, well, they just didn't know that the test was too hard for them. They just didn't know the material. Well, they're learning disabled. Of course it is. It's easy for us to point to student accountability for doing poor. But first and foremost, when you see discrepancies in the scores, especially when you have a student that has been referred to you for low performance in math, and they do maybe well on your test, or they're referred to you for low performance in reading, and they perform poorly in math and poorly in reading. So it's important to analyze student performance and look at those areas of weakness and look and see what variables or what accounts for that poor test performance. It can be things like individual factors, which are listed in a chart on page 46. So a student's poor performance can be attributed to individual factors or environmental factors. Why are they performing so poorly? You might also want to ask yourself, how would they perform under different testing conditions? Did I, as the assessor or the examiner, did I do everything I could to make sure that maximum results were yielded from that assessment? Was the lighting good? Was the test appropriate for their needs? Did I pick up on something such as poor visual spatial skills, and maybe we were doing block design and they performed poorly on that, which brought their entire IQ down? So it's really important to understand your student well before they get in there, and make sure that their results are definitely a true reflection of their performance on that test. And also remember that test scores do not always represent the child's typical performance, either good or bad. So just know that one assessment is one snapshot in time of how that student is performing on that assessment. Strategies for becoming an effective examiner. This starts on page 47. And there are 12 strategies for becoming an effective examiner. So you want to read through each one of those starting on page 47 and concluding on page 48. Make sure that you know the differences in these strategies, what makes an effective examiner versus someone who's not so effective. And at the end of this course, I want everybody to feel like they're an effective examiner, not only with the examination process, but also the interpretation and report writing and everything like that. So it's important to be aware of these 12 different strategies or these factors. And this slide is just another follow-up from chapter 1, just to review those steps in the assessment process, that these are the things that you're going to have to remember. These are obviously important steps in the assessment process. So this is a slide left over from that first chapter that I thought was important. Make sure that you go through the end of every chapter. Sattler does a really good job of providing you a summary, a very detailed summary at the end of every chapter. So if you can go through those and read each one of them and feel confident about that, then you've mastered that chapter. And I know there's a lot of information. That's why I'm doing these audios, especially when I haven't met with you yet, because there's a lot of information that is specifically for clinicians and psychometricians and people functioning in that capacity, and we're not doing so much of that. So I want to trim away a lot of the stuff that is unnecessary so that we can just get down to the bare bones of what we need to talk about. If you don't have any other questions, let's move on to chapter 3. If you do, post them in Blackboard and we'll definitely discuss at our first face-to-face meeting. All right, thank you.